Hey everyone, today I'll be looking at Halo Online, or more specifically using it as a tool to look at Halo 3's controls, because unsurprisingly Halo Online uses the exact same controls as Halo 3 does. It'll also be a good look into Halo Combat Evolve and 2's original Xbox controls, because they're quite similar, and I'll explain the differences a little later. But getting straight into it, Um, Halo Online and Classic Halo in general use a 27% square dead zone, or that's the approximate size. So you have to move your stick about 27% of the way before any cursor movement happens. But being square requires more movement in the diagonals before you see any cursor movement occur. Now, 27% is only slightly bigger than the norm at the time, which was about 25%. But even nowadays, with 20% dead zones and even 15% dead zones, which themselves are large, this is still quite large. You can just see how much stick movement I can make without any cursor movement occurring in game. And of course, the diagonals are even larger than that. Square dead zones also have a side effect where they restrict diagonal movement around the axes, basically the size of the dead zone, so this gets kind of worse as the dead zone gets larger and better as it gets smaller. But with a 27% dead zone, you can see there's quite a bit taken out. I can bob the stick up and down, but I'm moving perfectly left. I can point at a very obvious angle, and I'm still moving perfectly left. This applies to every kind of arm of this cross. This is very obvious when looking up or down because the view is capped and you just have to pay attention to horizontal movement, which only occurs in the screen region, which represents diagonal movement in general. So I can move perfectly left, but as soon as I move here, you can kind of see the crosshair rising subtly. Now, the big problem with this is that it pretty much makes almost all diagonal movement incorrect. These huge portions of the stick are only registering 4 directions, and that you don't lose any diagonal movement really, but it's all off shifted to these kind of green pie slices. So if you want to access a 1 degree angle, ideally you'd just do something like this, but with the square dead zone you'd have to move your cursor closer to this, and if you wanted to maintain it at different sensitivities, you have to move your stick at quite a few different angles and very kind of unintuitively to maintain that. Now, as far as the acceleration curve is pretty alright, at least horizontal, or at least cardinally. But once you reach this threshold right here, the view ramps up. That alone can be kind of awkward since you can't. There's no options to control how much or how fast this accelerates. But a far bigger issue with this is simply the shape of this threshold. So I'm going to be kind of roughly showing you by going in and out of it. The shape of this, you see it kind of dips inward. Now this does seem to happen vertically as well. However, it's difficult to test because Halo seems to separate or treat the X and Y axis differently, meaning that you're only going to see vertical acceleration when looking straight up or down, so you can't really see it diagonally like you could in other games. So it's impossible for me to test, but it'd be very difficult to test in general. But you could imagine it's probably similar to the same shape as horizontally, so there'd be a kind of inward bend that would go around something like this for the top and bottom. But now where the issue with the shape comes in is that, say for example, for a circular dead zone, this threshold should be circular, so it would follow this line or a little smaller depending on where the threshold was at. But for a square dead zone, what you'd actually want is a sort of rounded square. And the reason for that is so that the distance from the edge of the dead zone to the threshold is consistent everywhere. So from here to here, should be from here to here. That would be about the same distance. But since it bends inward, you actually lose quite a bit of um, diagonal range of motion compared to the cardinal. And this is pretty much the main reason why I say that classic Halo has terrible diagonal acceleration, because you reach this acceleration spike much faster than you do cardinally. So, but that's one thing. But the other thing is the acceleration in general seems to be affected by it. Now acceleration is going to already be affected just by using a square dead zone. Normally, it makes, in the sort of idealized square dead zone, it would create a kind of rounded circle. So if you wanted, like, say 50% acceleration, oh, let's just ignore the acceleration curve and acceleration jump right now, it would make kind of a rounded square shape. So, like, even though what I'm doing right now is different magnitudes, like this might be like 50% magnitude, this might be 53% or whatever it is. These are different magnitudes, but a square dead zone, this would be the same, but then it would kind of be consistent over here. But because this dips inward, it seems to kind of follow this threshold shape for the acceleration. So, like, this is pretty much max sensitivity before the acceleration jump. This is max sensitivity for a kind of pure diagonal. So if you're moving about half that, again, ignoring the exact specifics of the acceleration curve, you'd move your cursor right here, but you'd have to move it over here about to get the half speed for diagonal movement. And this is kind of quite different magnitudes from each other. So presumably this follows the same shape as a threshold, which makes general diagonal movement very unintuitive. It's sort of difficult to show, but if you try spinning your stick in a circle and avoid the acceleration jumps, that makes them really bad, but it feels very sloppy, very clunky, like there's a lot of different acceleration you're going through when you should have relatively consistent. I'm of course, my magnitude's changing when spinning it, but it should feel quite smooth, but it's pretty janky because of this. Now, specifically for Halo's Comet Evolve and 2 on the original Xbox, the only difference really from what you see here is that this threshold starts a little sooner. So it starts at about 85% and makes the same shape. So it still has the same issues, but you have kind of less range of movement in general. And that's really the only difference between between Halo 3 and Online and the original Xbox versions of the first 2 games. Now there's also an issue that the X and Y sensitivities are different, so you can see just how fast I'm turning left and right now, and then up and down. So there's a pretty considerable difference even when the acceleration kind of has time to ramp up. And this isn't uncommon at all. It's actually very common on console to do this. Oh, excuse me. But it does have some issues. One of them is it's just could be unintuitive. You might expect to make certain movements, but they're a little slower because you're trying to aim vertically. And as you can see, I'm spinning this cursor around right now, but it's making, instead of a circular movement, despite I'm making a circular movement with the stick, the cursor's making more of a more horizontally long ellipse shape. That's because the vertical isn't as sensitive as the horizontal. So that can be kind of unintuitive to use. But the far bigger issue about having different X and Y sensitivities is this changes diagonal movement and puts a bias on the more sensitive axis. So for example, this is supposed to be a 45-degree angle. I'm not hitting it too perfectly, but it's kind of close enough to show this. However, my cursor is moving at quite a bit more shallowly. It's moving at a more horizontal angle than what I'm inputting into the stick. And this is because the X and Y axes are different and the horizontal one is faster. And this happens in really any game with, I mean, you could test it yourself in any game with customizable X and Y sensitivity options. But since it does change diagonal movement like this pretty much means that like all the diagonal movement currently is pretty much wrong because of the square dead zone, because it's all off shifted, and these are only 4 directions really. But the only angles really left that would be accurate are these 45-degree angles, and since they're more horizontally biased now, they're wrong too. So it's kind of even more wrong. So that about really covers it. And well, aside from these issues, there's no options to control any. So if the dead zone's too big, you can't. You have to just deal with the setup. There's no acceleration. There's no options aside from sensitivity in really any of the games up until Halo 5. But that about covers it. Of course, this applies to online because this is what you're watching right now is Halo Online. But everything you see here is exactly the same for Halo 3 and basically comparable for the Xbox versions of Halo 2 and Combat Evolved. There are some slight differences with the Master Chief Collection versions and the anniversary version of Combat Evolved, but this is accurate to the original versions of all the original trilogy. And unfortunately, it's not good. You have a large dead zone, square dead zone. The diagonals are kind of completely out of whack. The acceleration, while good for kind of straight movements, even you can get used to these acceleration jumps. The diagonals are quite terrible, and it's unfortunate given that these kind of are the face of console FPS. There have been improvements later in the some minor improvements in the later Halo series, but for these classics, it's kind of fumble on pretty much every count. But that about covers it. Thanks for watching. You guys have a good rest of your day.